All right, so we're going to get into actually working the camera, because actually all we've been doing now is just pointing out stuff and explaining what stuff does. So we talked a little bit about setting up the camera, and this is more of the full setup. When you get a new camera, you will want to charge the battery for about 2.5 hours. Put the lens on like we've did, put the battery in, put the memory card in, but there's some other things. Make sure that you set the time and date. Actually, whoops, I jumped ahead one. Format the memory card. We talked a little bit about this when we went by format, but formatting the memory card is something I do on a regular basis. Make sure that you've downloaded your images and you've backed them up, because formatting them will get rid of the cards. But having said that, and we have a group of photographers that is listening in, I want to tell you all a big secret. If you're in a place where you're taking pictures and they don't like you taking pictures, and they say you're not allowed to take pictures, say, well, I'll reformat my memory card. And you can reformat your memory card, and then you can get some rescue software to get all your images back. And so don't let anyone confiscate your memory card. Take all those pictures, reformat it for the security guard, and then just go get the right software to get it back. So you can, well, if you can get the card out of your camera before they get there and replace it with a bogus card, that's a good thing. But I've had that situation at a concert where somebody was demanding that I give them the memory card, and I would refuse to do that. I'm not going to give somebody my memory card or my camera. But in general, formatting the memory card will kind of clean off all the ghost files and set it up for new use. Make sure you set the date and time, because that will be attributed to every photograph you take, and it's better to have it right than wrong. Attach your black rapid strap to the camera. Adjust the diopter knob so that that's clear to look through. One of the first things that you want to set is make a decision on shooting RAW versus JPEG, and you should probably do that from the very beginning. It's not something that most people switch back and forth on a lot. Go through the camera, the full features, basically what we just did, setting your camera up the way you want it to be. And then finally, before you do something really important, you should shoot some test photos and look for dust on the sensor. So for instance, photographing a white wall at f/22 will help you see any sort of dust on the sensor. And if you want to clean it off before you head off on a big vacation or on a big job, that's the time to take care of it. So these are things that you need to kind of go through to make sure that your camera is operating at 100%. So now that you know all the features of your camera, it is time for your final test. All right? And let's just kind of keep your cameras right in front of you and think about where all of these features are on your camera. So you might want to use your hands to just kind of point them out, because we're going to be moving them here pretty quickly. So your exposure modes, the big old dial on the left. Where do you change your shutter speeds? That's the dial in the back of the camera. The apertures are changed by the dial in the front of the camera. The ISO has an ISO button on the back. You'll press that and turn the back dial. The exposure compensation has a button right beside the shutter release, but you need to press that and the dial on the back of the camera. Metering is the button right beside it and the dial on the back. White balance, we go back to the back of the camera. The WB, we'll press that button and the main dial on the back of the camera. Focus button, this is the button that is on the side. It is unlabeled. It is in the middle of that autofocus manual focus button, so you will press that button and you will turn the back dial to change the focus mode. Now you will use that same button, but you will use the dial on the front to change the area that you are focusing, the number of brackets that you are choosing. And then finally, the drive mode is the rotating collar on the top left side, single, continuous low, continuous high, and so forth. And so these are the 10 modes that most people are going to use all the time. And these are the ones that you really need to know where they are on a regular basis. So let's go ahead and set our camera up in a super simple mode. So follow along with your own camera. First up, put it in the program mode, P for program. We won't need to worry about shutter speeds or apertures, but let's make sure our ISO is set to 100. So I'm going to move mine down to 100. Next up, let's make sure our exposure compensation is at 0. You can check by simply pressing the plus/minus button. I'm at 0, so that's good. Next up, let's have our metering at matrix metering. And that is the little dot in the middle with the 4 brackets kind of around each corner. So there's 5 spots in there. White balance on the back of the camera. Just press that and look down at the bottom. WBA is the white balance auto setting. If it's not, you can turn the back dial till you see the A. Focus mode, that's the button over on the side, and the dial in the back, AFS, S for single. And then we're going to have your AF area mode. Press the dial in and you'll have an auto, and all 39 points will show in the top LCD panel. The drive mode, we will set it single, so just make sure it's on the S setting for single. And this is a good setup for really, really simple, very basic photography. So let's set the camera up for some other types of things. This is how an enthusiast, somebody who, kind of likes photography and likes handling things a little bit more manually, might set their camera up. So let's change our camera to aperture priority A. Don't need to worry about shutter speeds. Let's set an aperture of f4 if you have it on your lens. You may or may not have it on your lens, depending on where your lens is. But that is the dial in front. Next up, check your ISO, make sure it's at 100. It was there for the last one, so it's there for this one. Check your exposure compensation, that you don't have that set someplace wacky. Metering. Matrix, I think, is a great general purpose metering system, as is white balance in automatic, which is where our last ones were. Focus at single, I think, is a good general place to be. And for AF area mode, I would personally change that to single point. That way you can be a little bit more selective about what you have chosen to be in focus. And then for the drive mode, keeping it in single, I think, is a fine place. And for an enthusiast photographer, I think this is a good setup on the camera. Since it's good to just practice with this, we're going to play around with some different ones here. All right, this is the old school retro style. And so if you're used to shooting old school, this is how you might like to set your camera up. Let's go ahead and set it into the M mode for manual. We need to set shutter speeds and apertures now, and just for kicks, let's set a shutter speed of 125th of a second. We do that with the back dial of the camera. 125 is 125th of a second. Let's set the front dial to F8. Why are we setting it at F8? Because the good old standby, how do you get a great picture? F8 and be there. It's good old National Geographic standard, photojournalism standard. Let's pump our ISO up to 100 just to play around with changing the change it up to 400. So you press the button on the back, turn the back dial. We're not going to worry about exposure compensation, but let's go to center weighted metering, because that's the way it used to be in cameras. And that's going to be the tiny circle with the two brackets to the left and right of it. White balance, we'll just go ahead and leave that in auto. That's fine. Focus. Let's turn the camera to manual focus. And the easiest and best way to do it is on the lens. Switch the A to M. If you have an older Nikon lens, you may not have a switch on your lens, and you would do it then on the body. But on most current lenses, you will see it on the lens itself. We don't need to worry about the AF area mode, but we will put the drive mode at continuous high. That way they can be ready for action at 6 frames a second. All right, so these next two are just simply for practice in where all the buttons are on the camera. So I'll try to go a little bit faster on this one. Nobody would ever set the camera up the way that I'm about to set your camera up, but let's go ahead and just do it for fun. S for shutter priority. Let's set a shutter speed of 1/2 a second. Very slow shutter speed. Yeah, I'm having problems getting down to 1/2 second. There we go. It's going to be just the number 2 in there. The camera's going to choose the aperture for you. ISO 6400, way up high. This is like the highest I would ever want to shoot a picture. Let's change our exposure compensation to +2. So you've got to press the exposure compensation and turn the back dial till it says +2. Next up, we're going to change the metering to spot metering. That's just the tiny little dot right in the middle. After that, we're going to change the white balance, the button on the back. We're going to change that to the flash mode, which is the lightning bolt. The focus mode, we're going to go to auto. Now, this isn't just autofocus, but this is the autofocus mode, if that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to me. But you have to turn the autofocus switch on the lens back on. That's the first step. And then you have to press the focus button on the side of the camera, turn the back dial till it says AFA, because then it will automatically choose whether it's going to focus on something that's still or something that's moving. It's not where I would normally recommend leaving it, but for this practice, it's fine. The AF area mode, let's go to 9 point. So when you go to 9 point, you press the focus mode, you turn the front dial, and you will see 9 points. It's a small set of squares in the LCD right in the middle of the focusing brackets. And on the drive mode, let's put it in the quiet mode and listen to it. Oh, it's so quiet. Now, if I'm losing some of you, good. That means I'm going fast enough. We'll try another one here. Try to follow along on this one. Test number 2. All right, let's get the exposure mode set at P for program. We don't need to worry about shutter speeds or apertures. Let's put an ISO in of 800. Dial that in. Next up, exposure compensation. Let's put that at -3. So we're going to go way back down to the other side. -3. Metering. Let's put this on center weighted metering. That's the dot with the 2 little brackets to the left and to the right. Let's try for white balance, incandescent. Press the white balance. The incandescent, what does the incandescent look like? It looks like, where is it? A little light bulb. It's actually right next to the A, and between the A and the fluorescent light bulb. And so it's got a bunch of light rays coming off just the bottom of it. For focus mode, let's go to continuous focus. So that's that focus button on the side of the camera, AFC. And for the AF area mode, let's try 3D tracking. It'll say 3D below the focusing brackets. And then finally, in the drive mode, let's throw it into the continuous low mode, where it shoots at a slower frame rate, but still pretty quick. Now, as I said, nobody's really going to set their camera up quite like this. So let's start looking at some real photography now that you know where all the important buttons are. So let's talk about a landscape photograph. All right, a couple of examples of landscape photographs. So kind of the idea that we're talking about here are things that aren't really moving very much. They might be blowing a little bit in the wind, but they're not generally moving around a lot. You might have a little bit of time to get the shot. You might be working with a tripod. And in general, depth of field is pretty important. You want a lot of things in focus. In fact, you might want everything in focus. So depth of field is going to be one of the primary changes you're going to make. Now, this is my own personal recommendations. I like shooting in manual in this type of mode. I have time to work with the camera and my subject. I can be very particular about shutter speeds and apertures. Now, if I'm on a tripod and things aren't moving, the shutter speed doesn't matter. But just for fun, let's go ahead and set a shutter speed of 4 seconds, just so that you can see that when you turn the focusing dial, the shutter speed dial in the back of the camera to 4 seconds, it'll say 4 with a couple of little hash marks beside it. But we want depth of field is what we really want here. And so this one's important. And I'm going to set it at f16. Now maybe your camera can go beyond this. Maybe you can go up to f22 or maybe beyond. But just for this purpose, we're going to set it at f16, which would give us lots of depth of field. For ISO, I would like that to be set as low as possible. So let's make sure that is down at 100. So we'll press the ISO and lower that down. Next up, we're going to want to make sure our exposure compensation is at 0, so nothing else is getting adjusted. It's not really going to affect us in manual, but we don't want to have that messed up because we were playing with that in the previous one. Now, there's different styles to working. I prefer to working in matrix, and so let's change it to matrix. And I will leave the auto white balance at auto, because I like to shoot raw and I don't have to worry about white balance, and I'll deal with it later in software if necessary. For focusing, I like to have it in single point focusing so I can be very selective about what I choose. So I'll press the focus button, turn the back dial till it says AFS. The AF area mode, I want to be very precise about what I choose, so I want the single point, which is just the one dot in the middle of the focusing brackets. And for the drive mode, I will probably just leave it in single because I can take one shot at a time. And so this is a good way to set your camera up for landscape photography. All right, so let's change things around and let's shoot a portrait. So when we're shooting portraits of people or dogs or animals or things like that, one of the things that we need to be concerned about is having a fast enough shutter speed to stop their movement as well as stopping our movement. These types of shots are rarely done from a tripod, and so you're going to be moving a little bit, they're going to be moving, so you need a fast enough shutter speed for that. But also just kind of a good look to photographs is a shallow depth of field. So the focus is on your subject's eyes. What's in the background is out of focus and not nearly as important. So depth of field is once again important, but we want a shallow depth of field here. So once again, I like to work in manual. I'll talk with a person, can I take your photograph? And they'll kind of expect that I'm going to work for a couple of minutes to take the photograph. I'll set a shutter speed, and it depends on the light levels, but just for fun, let's set 125th of a second. This would be a suitable handheld shutter speed to use with most lenses. For the aperture, I would want to shoot, it depends on the type of the picture, but a very shallow depth of field most likely. So if you have a lens that goes all the way down to 1.4, which I don't have, I will go down to f3.5 because that's as wide open as the lens that I have on here will go. But set it as wide as your lens will go. For the ISO, I once again want to have it as low as possible. I'll check that it's at 100. It's at 100. I know I'm getting the best quality information off my sensor as possible. We're not going to worry about exposure compensation, but you may need to when you take the picture. Matrix metering is good for general purpose as well as auto white balance, so that is something that's not going to change with a lot of these photographs. For focus though, we need to be very careful about the focus. Single focus is good here if our subjects are not moving around too much. If we're asking them to pose for us and they're not moving, we can focus on their eye, their cheek, their face, and be very precise about the focus, which is why we also want to just focus on the one point, so we can be very precise about where we're focusing. For instance, here you don't want to choose the 9-point focusing because you might focus on the person's nose and not their eyes, which may be at a different distance, and you don't want their nose in focus and their eyes out of focus. It's more important to have the eyes in focus. That's why you want the single point activated. And for the drive mode, I actually like to have it in continuous high. That way, as the subject's expression changes or their gestures change, you can just keep firing down on the shutter release. If they have a great look and you want to fire off a number of shots, it allows you to take a lot of pictures very quickly of a scene that looks great. Okay, let's try taking a blurry picture. Why would you want to take a blurry picture? Well, there's lots of good reasons to take blurry pictures. And so whether they're waterfalls or a panning shot of something moving, blur can be a great little aspect to still photography. And so here, shutter speed is key, choosing the right shutter speed. Once again, I prefer to shoot in manual on this. And the key is choosing the right shutter speed, and that's going to depend on your subject. For fun, let's set 1/15th of a second. So it's just going to say 15. And as far as the aperture, it's going to depend on the light level. It's not really important for this, so we're not going to set it. The ISO, we want that as good a quality as possible, so that will be at 100. Metering, once again, at matrix, and white balance will stay at auto, so those have not changed. The focus mode, I'm going to go into manual focus. I like to do these things manual focus. If I'm focusing on the waterfall, I might use live view and then magnify in to check to see that it's in focus. If I'm focusing on the panning shot, the dog running, I might manually focus on the ground where I see them coming and I know they're going to pass in front of me. That way, I don't have to worry about the autofocus working or maybe not working. Autofocus doesn't always get it right every time. And if I manually focus, pre-focus on the spot they're going to go in, I can be guaranteed that it's going to be properly focused. And so it's just a way for me to guarantee I'm going to get the shot I want. We don't need to worry about the autofocus area mode, but the drive mode, for at least the panning shots, I'll put that at continuous high so that I can get a series of shots as they go past. Would not be important in the waterfall shot, though. All right, let's do a more traditional action shot. So we're going to go to the sports. We're going to shoot something, some sort of action, something that's moving, something that's coming towards us, moving away from us. And one of the things that you want to kind of work on here is getting close to your subjects, either with a big lens or physically getting close to your subjects. It's very difficult for your camera to focus on a small little bird flying around across the street from your house. It's just not big enough in the frame for most things. So you need to get close to your subjects so your brackets have something to lock onto. So in action, the other important thing is that you need a fast shutter speed to stop the motion. Now, I like manual for this, as I do many things. And for action, a 500th of a second is a good place to be. You might need something faster. It depends completely on the action that you're photographing. Sports photographers really like lenses that go down to 2.8. So if you can go down to 2.8, get your lens down there. And this is a reason why a lot of photographers like some of those more expensive lenses that go down to 2.8. If not, you may just need to open your lens up as wide as it can go. ISO, this is where you probably will need something more than 100. So go ahead and set ISO 400. That's a good starting point. Once again, it completely depends on the light levels. I think matrix metering is fine, and white balance in auto is fine as well. Focusing, this is really important here. You set this to continuous. So it's the focusing button on the side of the camera. And remember, in our last subject, we had switched the lens to manual. So you got to switch that back to autofocus, press the focusing button, and go to AFC for continuous. That way it will continually adjust for the subject as it moves. And you may want to try different areas, from 39 points to 21 points to 9 points. Just for fun, set it at 21 points, which kind of looks like a big circle of dots. It's going to totally depend on the types of composition you have and the types of sports that you're shooting as to which one is the best. And then finally, for the drive mode, I would of course set that at continuous high so that you could get as many pictures as possible when the right action happens. All right, a couple of other types of photography. I call this just maximum sharpness. So these are situations where there's nothing great of depth of field that you need. So there's no tremendous depth of field. There's nothing really moving around, but you just want to get the sharpest possible picture. Now, this usually is going to require a tripod. And as we set the camera up, this is kind of with a tripod in mind. First off, I'll be in the manual exposure mode. Shutter speed doesn't really matter, but let's just for fun set a 2-second shutter speed just to practice setting shutter speeds. And if we're on a tripod, as I say, shutter speed doesn't matter. The sharpest place on your lens is somewhere between the smallest opening and the largest opening. It's the middle of the range. For many cameras, it's going to be around f11. It does totally depend on the lens that you have on that camera. ISO, you will definitely want at 100. So in our sports mode, we were at 400, so we got to dial that back down to 100. I think matrix metering is fine, and white balance in auto is fine if you were shooting RAW. For focus mode, here's where you want to change it back to the single point. So your camera can focus on one solid object and then stop. And then this is where you'll want to change back to the single point mode so that you can be very precise about exactly where your camera focus is. So the one focus bracket in the middle. And for the drive mode, this is where you would use the mirror up mode, and preferably a cable release, so that when you take a picture, and what's going to happen here on this camera in front of me is I'm going to press it once and the mirror's going to go up, and you can hear it go up, listen, and then I'll press it again to take the picture. And it's got a 2-second exposure that I set. So I will do this once again, listen, mirror up, that's the opening shutter, and that's the closing shutter. And so I would have a cable release if I was to do this properly. And that's why you have those cable releases or wireless remotes. And so that's how I would set up for a number of different types of photography. But let's do one last one just to leave the camera in a good position. And I would just call this basic photography. Where would I leave the camera if I'm just walking around and I don't know what my next picture is going to be and I just want it to be ready to take a basic picture? I've set manual on pretty much everything, but this is where I will actually go to aperture priority just for a little bit of speed. I'm not going to worry about shutter speed, but I am going to open my lens up so that it's at a pretty reasonable opening. In this case, I'm going to open it to f4. If I need to close down for more depth of field, I'll do that at the time. But if something's happening fairly quick, I know this will give me a reasonable shutter speed. I like to have my camera set at ISO 100 most of the time. I will bump that up as necessary according to the light. Double check your exposure compensation. Make sure that's not set in some funky place. You want to have it set at 0 to start with, and then you will change it as needed from there. Matrix metering's good. Auto white balance is fine. For focusing, I will be in single, so AFS for single. That way I can choose one spot for it to lock onto, and I will choose a single point that I have very good discretion on where that point is. This is a person's eye, a cart coming down the street. And for the drive mode, I will just usually leave it in the single shot mode. So I think this is a good general purpose setup mode on the camera just for being ready for the next shot, whatever that may be. So we'll take a look at some questions and see if somebody has questions on, concentrate on setting up their camera for shooting pictures in any particular modes.
Yes, there are questions. Another question from Shasta. Can the focus points be set in clusters to follow action?
If you use the auto or the 3D tracking modes, they can track movement within the group of brackets. And the 3D mode, once again, these are things that are highly particular to the types of action that you're shooting. And so it might work well for certain sports photography, but doesn't work well for kids running around a playground or vice versa. So you might want to play around with those different modes to see which one works best for you.
Okay, Piranha had actually answered that in the chat room, but I just like to.
Oh, okay.
I just like to hear what you have to say.
A couple of questions on autofocus area. One about how to choose the settings, and can you explain a little bit about what they should focus on? I know we don't want to go into probably too much detail, but just,
so they're talking about the brackets that you can choose?
Yeah, I believe so.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, once again, that's the focus button down here on the side of the camera, and it's the dial on the front of the camera. And what you can choose somewhat depends on what focus mode you're in. Right now I'm in AFS, and it only allows me to go from single point to auto everything. If I go back over to single continuous, then I can go into the 3D mode, I can go into the 9-point, 21-point, 39-point modes. And so what you are focusing on just depends on how you work with the camera. And this is a learning setup that you're going to have to work with the camera, and this is why professional photographers will take their cameras out and practice to see which modes work best for what they want to do. And so by all means, get out there and practice with your camera to figure out which ones work best for you. But it's basically choosing what areas you want to focus on. And so keep your instruction booklet with you and try some different modes out, and get your neighbor's kid to ride their bike up and down the street a few times and take pictures of them or something like that.
David R. had asked, is there a way to take these settings you're showing and tie them to the U1 and U2 settings?
Absolutely. That's where the save settings are in the setup menu, I believe, where you can take these and you can make your own versions of them. You didn't like one or two of the things that I did, which is perfectly okay, because this is all seasoning to flavor as you like it. And so you could adjust these settings if there's something you do on a regular basis and have them as your U1 and U2 setting.
Well, because Veggie had asked earlier if these things you're showing are options in the camera, and I had said no, that you had created these and you have to do the work in the camera, but you can kind of set it up.
You can set it up yourself, yeah.
But you still have to do the work.
Oh, the original once, yes.
Once, okay.
You have to do that. That's a pretty good deal. Do it once and it's done
that's
automatically for the rest of the life of the camera.
That's not bad.
Can you copy one memory card to the other in camera?
Yes, you can, which I think is one of the coolest things ever.
That's awesome.
Because I have been wanting to copy things on one memory card to the other, and I would ask, what's the least expensive item where I can copy things? And the least expensive item for the longest period of time was a laptop computer, which seems rather large and expensive just to copy information from one memory card to another. And then there became smaller portable hard drives that you could do that on. But still, it's nice to be able to do that in a camera by itself.
Passenger, I'm not really sure how to pronounce that name, said if you asked if you could talk about setting up the auto exposure lock and autofocus lock and the best uses of those.
That depends greatly on how you use your camera. On the back of your camera is this auto exposure, autofocus lock button. And if you use aperture priority, shutter priority, or program, and you are focusing and recomposing a lot, and you want to lock those exposures in, it becomes a very important button. It's a button I don't use at all, ever. Because I shoot in manual exposure, I will figure out what shutter speed and aperture I want, and then I can point the camera anywhere I want, and the shutter speeds and aperture stay exactly the same. And so it depends totally on the workflow, as much as I hate that terminology. It depends on how you use your camera. If you use your camera in a program, aperture, shutter priority mode a lot of the time, and you use spot metering, which I haven't talked much about, once again, personal style, then you would use that button more. And so it's a personal style issue. I think with digital cameras and the feedback and the histograms, being able to look at all this stuff, I'm much more comfortable shooting manual, checking the results on the back of the camera, making sure things are right, and then proceeding into the real part about the shoot. And so, a style issue.
Right. Once you get more and more comfortable, you're going to want that control.
Right, right.
This question's come up a couple of times from the one from Angel Lad about shooting RAW and JPEG at the same time. And I think I must have missed this, but you can save the RAW on one card and the JPEG on the other?
That's correct, yeah.
So now her kind of, along with that, can you, once the RAW card is full, can you tell the card, okay, I just want to shoot JPEG, and it will just save to the second card, or?
You could do that. That was one of the things that I was about to talk about anyway after I heard that question, is let's say you stick in a couple of 16 gig cards. You shoot RAW to one and JPEG to the other. The RAW is going to fill up a lot quicker than the JPEG. Well, as soon as that RAW card is filled up, your camera stops firing. Even though there's plenty of space on the smaller JPEG card, you might say, you would have to maybe either switch slots that they're in, or more importantly, switch the designation in the menu system about how you are storing images. And so you have to be a little bit careful about that, about the sizes of the files, and get that squared away before you do that too much.
Okay, thank you.
Vasu had asked if you're damaging the camera by shooting lots of continuous high pics, and they said they're concerned.
Shooting what again?
They say continuous high pics.
High pictures. Maybe they're talking about using the continuous high. Well, you know, the camera's durability. How long is a camera going to last? And the only real statistic that they put out is the number of shutter firings, because that's probably got the biggest wear and tear on it. And so just needlessly taking pictures is probably not good on the camera. This camera, although I haven't seen it stated, I'm pretty sure it's probably rated at around 100,000 firings, which is a pretty long life for most people. Your camera could die before that. It could go on for several hundreds of thousands. It just depends on a lot of other factors. But it's not necessarily putting it in the high drive mode or shooting lots of pictures at any one time. The camera is designed to process lots of images, but just firing the shutter release a lot does put wear and tear on the camera and will eventually break.
I had noticed someone in the chat room earlier had said for this camera it's 150.
It could be 150. It's minimum 100.
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, when you think about it, I've had my digital SLR for 5 years, and I'm just over 60,000. So.
Yeah.
I mean, except unless you're a wedding photographer and you shoot 3,000 per wedding, and you do that, and you're doing 2 of those a weekend.
Right.
And, I mean,
yeah. For some people,
depends. It adds
this
up.
is not a professional camera.
Right.
I mean, it's a professional may be perfectly happy using it, but it's not designed at professional standards, which go up to 200 and beyond, 200,000 firings.
Okay, this was a question that's come up several times, so I'm just going to ask for Janice. Janice asks, I've read that if I don't change my settings from autofocus to manual focus and then move the focus ring, I'll damage the camera and or lens. Is this true?
Maybe. The answer is maybe. It depends on the lens. Nikon has been going through a evolutionary change on their lenses. Now the kit lens here, it doesn't say so. This isn't something that's just kind of, doesn't have a big label on it. This lens has a special clutch motor in it. The camera is in autofocus and I can turn the focusing ring and it's basically completely disengaged from the camera. There are older manual focus lenses and typically they are ones that have apertures on the lens itself. On those lenses, you don't want to be doing that because it's basically the drive shaft in the camera. You are forcing that motor manually when that should only be turned by the motor inside the camera. And so if you are in autofocus and you go to the focus ring and you turn it and it feels kind of stiff, don't turn it. If it's in autofocus and you turn it and it's smooth, it's not going to hurt it, but it's not going to do anything either. And so you do have to be careful on certain lenses. And in general, trying to think if there's a lens designation to where if it's an AFS or an AFI lens, you don't have to worry about it. On previous autofocus lenses, you do need to switch it on the body into manual focus so as not to cause a problem on the lens. And so if you have an older manual lens, you will need to switch this on the body. If you use newer lenses, this switch on the body should pretty much always be at AF. It's just for older manual Nikon lenses. Good question, though.
Okay.
Perfect.